First, I just want to say it is amazing to be back here in Anarchapulco. This is my third Anarchapulco experience. There's been some serious progression within this movement, but at the same time, it is a very, very different world that we are living in today. The current state of the left-right paradigm has changed dramatically from where it was last year, and certainly the year before that, and I feel that our momentum has somewhat been stifled, but certainly only for the time being. Donald Trump seems to have ignited this populist movement of nationalists who are now championing for the state to solve the problems of the state. And I felt that we were making a lot of progress in terms of enlightening people as to the false left-right paradigm, which really keeps us just thinking in groups. With the nation-state as a tribe, we have a pocket of freedom-minded individuals that recognize that they are individuals, and they have some clue as to the problems and the solutions, but even amongst our own crowd, a diversity of opinion shouldn't permit amoral or cultural relativism. Yet, when it comes to the Trump presidency, many are adopting the principles of the left, and they're engaging in this social relativism game, and to me that's very dangerous to get into. Now, I think most of us here today can agree that democracy is really just an insidious form of communism, and I don't think that's going to be changing anytime soon. And just like communism, democratic states really run counter to human nature. You can't say that it's good in theory, but bad in practice, because if it's bad in practice, then by definition, it's a bad theory. Now, there are some anarchists or libertarians who view Donald Trump as the lesser evil of Hillary Clinton, and I definitely get that. That's fine. I totally get that. But it's another thing to actively campaign for him, even if you don't consider yourself a strict anarchist or a libertarian. Democracy really just legislates moral and cultural relativism, and it needs rejecting root and branch. I hope to live in a world someday where calling yourself a Democrat or a supporter of democracy would be just as ridiculous as somebody coming here and calling themselves a Marxist or a fan of anarcho-communism. Now, Donald Trump is giving the appearance of being anti-globalization, but he's really just another thug who's using this position that's being bestowed upon him to his advantage. His populist support is embarrassing, really, and it really goes to show just how far we still have to go in order to undermine democracy completely. But in order to do that, we're going to have to closely analyze all of the current divide and conquer tactics that are at play here. Never before have I seen the state of the so-called tolerant left and the so-called alt-right clashing with one another to the point of escalating to all-out violence. You can now apparently be #Spencered. That's when you get threatened with physical violence by the left, as has happened to me many times. I've been called a white supremacist, a bigot, a racist, an Islamophobic, which really is a ridiculous term, and I've been threatened with physical violence for merely questioning the compatibility of Islam with the West and our Christian Western cultures and values here. And while we continue to bicker and argue about these, these clashes begin to get worse between the left and the right, and this continues to intensify, the powers that ought not to be are really sitting back with a big grin on their face, watching all of this, because they know the extreme importance of making the pain and suffering of separation far outweigh any issues that they may have had with abandoning their sovereignty in favor of uniting together into one, all for the common good of humanity, of course. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Milo Yiannopoulos. He was a speaker here last year at last year's Anarchapulco, but the organizers of this very fine event have decided to cancel his attendance at the conference this year, and for very good reason. Simply put, statism cannot be fought with more statism. The problems of the government are never going to be solved by the government itself. In fact, only mayhem and destruction begin to occur when you play into this by placing yourself onto this left or right. But this clash we're seeing right now is happening on multiple fronts, at all levels, from the very lowest right to the highest. Recently, we've been told that Donald Trump went to war with the security agencies and the intelligence communities, and they're now getting back at him. People are leaking classified information to the press, stuff that's getting people fired. Just look at what happened with the latest debacle with General Flynn. He was forced to resign on February 13th as a result of getting caught lying about whether or not he discussed sanctions in a December telephone call with a Russian diplomat. Now, the very same people who were calling Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and Tom Drake and so many other Obama-era leakers criminals are now praising those who leaked this highly sensitive classified information that brought down General Flynn. And now President Obama's top national security advisor, James Clapper, he was caught red-handed lying to the public and also to Congress, which is a felony. And despite lying about domestic surveillance programs that the courts ruled was illegal, he kept his job right on up to the very last day of the Obama presidency. So while the left have suddenly rediscovered the virtues of illegal leaking, Trump supporters are now adamant about rooting out the so-called criminal leakers. And this is just a couple of small examples of how this narrative is always being crafted and designed in order to play us off one another. The powers that be need this trump card, as it were, to establish the order out of chaos that they are trying to create. And that's what it really all comes down to. Order out of chaos is the name of the game. And when it comes to various conflicts and democracy in general, the global elite have always backed two sides all throughout history. So I'm wondering, why does anybody think that it's going to be any different here today in the 21st century? What evidence is there that anything has changed where the Illuminati or the ruling elite are no longer in control? They were present throughout history, and we're supposed to believe now that they're just not here controlling world events? Wars have been fought, people have been assassinated, private central banks have been set up everywhere, but we're supposed to believe that Donald Trump somehow slipped through the cracks. At this stage of the game, you cannot become president of the United States by chance. I should probably repeat that. At this stage in the game, you cannot become president of the United States just by chance. If Trump were a real threat to the establishment, he would not be in this position. He is merely being played like a puppet, really, by dark forces in the physical and the spiritual realms. These people are into the occult. It's very documentable that many of these key players, they attend Bohemian Grove, they go to Skull and Bones, they engage in ancient rituals, and it's not just for fun and games, folks. Billionaires do not take time out of their very busy and valuable schedules to just do this for shits and giggles. And the fact is, they're going to have no problem taking down the current status establishment and replacing it with a more libertarian establishment. So an anarchist or a libertarian society could still lead to all-out tyranny, where individuals are chipped and micromanaged for security, albeit the security would be voluntary and privately owned instead of government, which is only a marginal improvement, and it really does not address these darker forces, the Luciferian forces that are behind this push for a one-world government. Remember, it's all about chaos, and knowing how they manipulate us into going down the road of this path of our own destruction, we have to be very careful moving forward. So let me present to you a scenario in terms of the Hegelian dialectic, where statism, let's say, is the thesis. Libertarianism or anarchism is the antithesis, with all-out fascism and global authoritarianism being the synthesis. And if we are not careful, the future will lead in this direction. And I'm here to tell you today that there does exist a Luciferian elite who will control this new emerging apparatus. The blockchain may appear outside of elite control, but at the end of the day, as our technologies and our economies merge, as statism fails and it gives way to more market-based solutions, somebody somewhere is going to want to put a chip in your body to identify you. And at the end of the day, does it really matter if it's a private security and identification agency or if it's the state? So this one world libertarian order, if we can call it that, is going to be much like the Tower of Babel, where everyone's speaking the same language of ones and zeros. And since the market is a much more efficient at building this kind of tyranny, the elite will forego any status intervention, so long as the belief system of the people do not recognize their atheistic, materialist philosophy as the real prison that the powers that be have them in. They will accept freer capital markets as if they've won the battle. But much like this story of the Tower of Babel, without God in the picture, guys, the idea of liberty and freedom is really only half complete. So how do we deal with these divide and conquer tactics that are seeking order out of chaos in some sort of way that's not going to resemble a Babylonian Tower of Babel type scenario? And if you're not familiar with the story of the Tower of Babel, I'd suggest you add that to your data bank of knowledge, because there's a lot of truth in the story of the Tower of Babel. And I'm not talking about the literal interpretation. I'm speaking more about the concepts and the warnings contained therein about the dangers of collectivism and the importance of maintaining our individuality and the truth of where we came from. The elite have conditioned us into a philosophical, materialist society devoid of any sort of religious truth. This idea doesn't even warrant any kind of a response. In fact, it hardly ever enters the discussion at all, but it's as real and truthful as history and science itself. And whether we like it or not, we all have an archetypal hero to which we look up to. So who is that in your life? Maybe it's a superhero from a graphic novel, or maybe it's somebody from real life history like Murray Rothbard or Ludwig von Mises. Or maybe when it comes to emulating behavior, you follow the teachings of Christ. And if you find that yourself in that camp, well, congratulations, because that means you're acting truthfully, you're acting sincerely, you're being true to yourself, your family, your friends, and your community. And I believe unless the West rediscovers this tradition, unless they rediscover this, rediscovering Christ and what he taught, and the fact that he was the very foundation of our civilization, we're not only going to prevent true liberty from spreading, but the freedom movement will only get half of this archetypal equation correct. Because without Christ, the movement is going to be missing the full spectrum of how one should conduct themselves and act properly. It's not just about abolishing the state, although I'm obviously totally for that. It's really about how to conduct oneself and how to act properly and press for truth, as it were. So, moving forward, I think it's incredibly important that the individual needs to become conscious of the fact that the group, culture, nation, state, tribe, whatever you want to call it, is subordinate to his or her value system. I think most of us intuitively know that. Even leftists can't deny this. They throw around their words, but their actions demonstrate otherwise. Our actions demonstrate the validity that only individuals act. A group is merely just a bunch of individuals. And if individuals leave, the group ceases to exist. Everyone here knows that to some degree, but there are many who are ignorant of this, and they're even going to argue the opposite. And they are the ones who really need to become conscious of the fact that the group is subordinate to the individual. And once everybody understands that and can properly articulate that, then we can have a rational discussion about, how taxation is theft and what it is we need to do about the current state of the government. Thanks, guys.